So let's get this out of the way. Resident Evil 8 is not a bad game. I repeat, it is not a bad game. It's not even mediocre. It's a well-polished experience, one that has decent shooting, a cool setting, and entertaining villains. Tons of replay value too, with mercenaries and the reward system from Resident Evil 3 Remake. There is a lot I do like about Resident Evil 8 on paper, but honestly I'd be lying if I said I wasn't underwhelmed by it as a whole. And I've been thinking a lot as to why that is, and how I can explain it in a way that doesn't invalidate the love this game is getting, but communicate why it just didn't land for me. Because the thing is outside of my own sense of enjoyment, there is a lot of good that comes from Resident Evil 8's existence. But playing it, there were so many design choices that left me scratching my head as to what the intent of this game even was. Either through ideas that were underdeveloped, aspects that were oversold, even story beats that even for a Resident Evil game are fucking hokey. So let's start with a quote, shall we? In an interview with Axios Gaming, producer Tsuyoshi Kanda, I hope I pronounced that right, said, "When we develop a new Resident Evil game, our goal is not always to make it scarier than the previous title, but to find a balance to deliver a scary but fun experience for players." Later following that up with, some of the feedback we received regarding RE7 was that it was too scary to play. Kanda also added, "In one regard, that's exactly what we're striving for, so it's a huge compliment to us. But at the same time, it's always our goal to create something that anybody can feel comfortable jumping in and playing. So we eased up on the tension curve in Resident Evil Village, relative to Resident Evil 7, so that players aren't in constant fear." The intent here was clear: tone things down to make a Resident Evil that can appeal to a bit of a wider audience. Now, I know this could sound like a they dumb things down for casuals argument, but it's not that. Because remember, Resident Evil hasn't had the most consistent past. I mean, you got the classic horror experiences that kicked off the genre, or at least helped push it forward, to the actiony games like Resident Evil 4, to full-on co-op shooters, to even more off-the-wall co-op shooters. And they got spin-offs like railgun shooters and online multiplayers. Point is that Resident Evil isn't just about the horror anymore. It hasn't been just about the horror for a long time. Resident Evil 8 is the first game in the series to make an honest attempt to make both those sides come together in harmony, to create an experience that is both frightening and action-packed from start to finish. And I would say in the grand scheme of things, they succeeded. RE8 stands out in the franchise for how it's able to take these elements from both the classic games and the actiony games and mix them together. As you go through it, you will be presented with a lot of returning mechanics from Resident Evil 4 actually. There's a merchant again, enemies drop resources now, and there's treasures to collect throughout the map and then sell. This all creates a game that, despite being a direct sequel to Resident Evil 7 and being built off those mechanics, has a completely different dynamic. If Resident Evil 7 was a homage to the first game, then 8 is a homage to 4. Taking the first-person perspective from 7 and adding in more action does create a game that may be less scary than 1, 2, or even 7, but also manages to stay out of the realm of complete ridiculousness that 5 and 6 went into. There will be tons of people who do love this game because it reaches that middle ground. I'm just not one of them. I'd rather a game that does something particularly well than a game that does multiple things and nails none of them. And that's where I'm at with Resident Evil 8. Everything in this game is done well, but there's nothing that is done amazingly, if that makes sense. Like, nothing really wowed me or pulled me into the gameplay loop through both of my playthroughs. Let's start with the combat. Mechanically, it's the same as 7, but with a few tweaks. Ethan is slightly faster in both his walking speed and gun switching speed. There's a push feature, but really it's context sensitive, and honestly, I didn't even know it existed throughout my playthroughs. Like, I figured it out by watching another player play this game. The main difference isn't so much Ethan, but the type of enemies you will encounter and the frequency in which you will encounter them. Enemies are a lot more nimble than the molded, and you will be encountering them a whole lot more. The problem I end up having here is that the combat isn't deep enough to accommodate the increase in enemies. Resident Evil 4 had amazing combat, and that's why its increase in enemies worked. There's a lot you could do with the combat system in that game, and that created a lot of replayability as you got better and better at it each time you played. I mean, with the pistol alone, you had more options in that game than Resident Evil 8 gives you. Now, I get this is a direct sequel to 7, and Ethan isn't the bodyguard for the president. Basic combat isn't new to Resident Evil, and usually combat doesn't have to be great in these games. But in a game like, say, 1 or 7, combat wasn't the main focus. In fact, if you play those games right, you are avoiding combat more than you are engaging in it. That's because those games were more based off a sense of fight or flight, along with all the other micromanaging you have to do. Most of the time, combat is a choice you have to make to engage in, and it's something you have to weigh heavily before you make that decision. That's not so much the case here. You are actively encouraged to take part in combat as much as possible in this game. As I said, you got a lot of systems making a return from Resident Evil 4. The main one being the Merchant. He really is just a slightly improved version of everyone's favorite trenchcoat weirdo. You need points. How do you get them? Well, you can find some of them in the environment and from treasures, but mostly it's fighting enemies. You are not really encouraged to run at all unless for specific segments designed to make you do so. So all this just turns combat into mindlessly shooting the enemy until they're dead. Not only is it hard to be afraid when the solution to everything is just shoot it and the things you can't kill are super obvious, but it just makes the game boring and tedious. Again, mindless really is the word here. There's no dynamics to combat. And there's not even a whole lot of enemy variety. It all just comes down to shoot the enemy until they die and try to keep your distance in the meantime. Again, a combat system I don't mind when combat isn't the main focus and there's only a few parts in the game that force you to take part in it, but that's not the case here. I mean, I guess you can run past the enemies. There's nothing saying that you have to fight them, but again, you'll lose out on a lot of points, and that means less upgrades, so why wouldn't you kill everything you see? This does have the intended effect of lowering the tension for those who maybe found Resident Evil 7 too scary, but overall it just hurts the game for me, making replaying it pretty tedious. Combat just never plays out differently. There's no learning curve to it like Resident Evil 4. That learning curve is the main reason I love replaying that game even to this day. There's a sense of moment-to-moment decision-making with it. Who to shoot, where to shoot them, how to effectively use headshot kick combos, countering axe or even TNT throws. These micro-choices is what keeps RE fresh to this very day. And without anything like that in Resident Evil 8, the focus on combat just makes the game more boring. And then there's the dumbing down of the inventory system itself, something that Resident Evil 4 did, but again, it had the great combat to make up for that. Without the great combat, these systems really just do feel like they're dumbed down. The only thing you actually hold in your inventory now are weapons, healing items, ammo, and meat for like this cooking quest in the game. Yes, this game has a cooking quest, because every game needs to have some sort of cooking minigame now. Everything else from key items to crafting resources to the treasures are just permanent items and separate item pools that don't take up any room and you don't have to think about until you actually need them in that moment, making inventory management pretty much non-existent. There isn't even item boxes, and I think this is just a bad move. At least if this game had more of a traditional RE inventory system, it would have kept some of the moment-to-moment decision-making, but without it, it just makes the game even more mindless. I get this was supposed to be a more accessible Resident Evil game, but inventory management is part of the experience. Not knowing what's ahead, trying to decide what you're going to bring with you, and how much space you're going to leave for new items is fun. It's part of the fun. Now that choice just isn't there. Just about the only choice you have over your inventory is what you craft with the resources you pick up. But if I'm being honest, I got so much resources that after a certain point, I was only crafting shit out of boredom and not necessity. Then there is the village, which both is and isn't the main area of the game. Let me explain. None of the actual big moments happen in the village. In fact, the 4 lords you fight all have their own areas that feel pretty separated from the village. This turns it into more of a hub area than anything else. Instead of being the place that you mostly inhabit and unfolds as you progress throughout the game, it's more of a return point between going after the main baddies. Now, I actually do like this. After each area, you usually get an item that unlocks more of the village that has more loot and better equipment for you, giving you a reason to explore it each time you return to it. But I also think it could have been a bit better. For starters, I don't like how the boss areas get locked off after you complete them, meaning that any treasures you missed in those parts of the game are now gone until the next playthrough. I also feel like this would have been way cooler if we got a choice in the order we face the lords. Now, I get why they didn't do that, it's for story reasons, but I truly think given the design of the village in this game as a whole, it would have been cool if we did get a choice. It would have created a system where the weapons and extras you unlock in the village are based on the order you tackle everything in. You could have done a bit of a Mega Man system with it, where you make certain areas harder to beat in the early game, but doing so would reward those players with better gear faster, and would make different playstyles stand out. As it stands, the way you move throughout the village in the game is pretty linear. Speaking of restrictions, this game puts way too much of an emphasis on set piece moments. I mean, like, the first hour of this game is just like one set piece after another. And when I say set piece, I don't mean like in the Uncharted sense, just more like moments where you have to run along a set path or do things in a certain order, and that's the only way you can do it, and you usually have some sort of threat encouraging you to do it fast. I mean, like, 2 out of the 4 lords come down to exactly this. And then there's like a section near the end of the game that pretty much turns into Chris of Duty. And again, this just hurts a lot of the replay value for me, because these moments are going to play out exactly the same every time. Even if the set piece is good, which some of them are, once you know the solution, it's just going through the motions. And just like combat, the way you move throughout this game feels very curated and one note instead of feeling like a natural result of you exploring the game world or getting lost. I mean, it's hard to actually even get lost, and in that sense, it's less interesting to move through as a world. All these elements combined create an RE game that just doesn't grab me. Sure, it has good moments and cool shit in it, but the moment-to-moment gameplay loop feels really lacking. The game at no point really demanded me to think about how I explore, fight, or manage resources. A lot of this game for me was just going through the motions. Like, this game is definitely better than 5, 6, and arguably Resident Evil 3 Remake, but it's nowhere as close to the greatness of Resident Evil 1 Remake, Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 4, or even Resident Evil 7 in my opinion. Like, Resident Evil 7 wasn't a perfect game. In fact, that second half is just dreadful, but the best moments of 7 were really good, and I just didn't have any moment like that with Resident Evil 8. I mean, it's definitely a lot more of a consistent game, and if you care about that, then yeah, it's definitely better than Resident Evil 7, but again, nothing really wowed me. At least Resident Evil 7 had a couple moments that really gripped me. Furthermore, because the game doesn't really grab me, I start focusing on little shit like the plot, which I typically don't care about in a Resident Evil game because they're all kind of hokey, but usually I'm enjoying myself. I mean, one thing you've probably heard in all reviews, positive or not, is that Ethan is kind of a dipshit. But I mean, I'm going to take that one step further and say that Chris is also a fucking dipshit in this game, because this is the type of plot that only happens because the main characters are fucking stupid. And then there's the ending plot twist with Ethan, which only raises more questions than it actually solves. Or answers. Whatever the correct term is. And don't even get me started on Lady Dimitrescu. She was way over promoted. Like, I'm not gonna say it was false advertising. They just oversold her. She has very little presence in the actual game. She is the first lord you fight, and in my first playthrough, she was dead in like the first 3 hours. And she didn't even really show up until the hour mark, so that's like, what, 2 hours of on and off screen time? But the marketing would have you believe that, like, she is the main pull of this game. Listen everyone. I like sexy, tall vampire chicks as much as the next person. Which is why I'm sad she has very little presence in the game. She's easily the best villain. Why does she not have more presence in the game? What, Heisenberg's supposed to carry the plot? Actually, low-key, Heisenberg is pretty entertaining. He pales in comparison to Lady D. What sucks about it, too, is that her part of the game is easily the best part of the entire game, because it feels most like a Resident Evil game. Plotting routes, unlocking more of a mansion that loops back in on itself, running into a giant enemy who stalks the area. But then, when that's over, the next 2 areas are set-piece moments with little actual exploration. The last area is a bit more open, but not nearly as interesting as Castle Dimitrescu. The only thing it has going for it really is that there's some new enemy types, but they aren't that interesting. The only thing that sets them apart from regular enemies is that they have weak points you have to shoot, which doesn't really add any real variation to the combat. It's like, great, we went from shooting guys until they're dead, to shooting them in a specific spot until they're dead. Then you get the Chris of Duty segment, just point the laser at the target and you call in airstrikes, and you mindlessly shoot some more lichens. And that's why I didn't enjoy Resident Evil 8 that much, or at the very least compared to other games, because here's the thing, I wouldn't say I had a bad experience with it. Just compared to other Resident Evil games, this is kind of a weak one for me. But I guess it would be fair to go over some of the things I do like, because for as mindless as I find it, that doesn't mean that there was no fun to have with this game. The setting, for example, is fantastic. The village is dripping with so much visual character that, like, it's just a treat to walk around in. Though Lady Dimitrescu does steal the show, the other villains are entertaining in their own right. I also really enjoy this move to more mythical horror. It opens the door for the series to be a whole lot more creative in the future, which I think is ultimately good for the series. I mean, both zombies and the Plagas got stale at some point, and the Molded just weren't that compelling of an enemy. They just weren't. The Molded kind of sucked. Imagine a Resident Evil game where we fight Medusas or like a Frankenstein monster, like an actual Frankenstein monster. I mean, there's something kind of like that in this game already. Also thought the puzzles were pretty good. I've heard people say they're too easy, but I actually disagree with them. They're definitely not the hardest in the series, that's for sure, but they weren't immediately obvious either. There's this section just before going to fight the Third Lord Moreau, where there's this extremely powerful lichen. I don't know its name and I'm not looking it up at this very moment, because I'm a professional. But either way, they roam this area and can be killed or snuck past. And this part was great. One of the few moments where I felt like there was a choice to how I approach things. The incentive to avoid this thing felt meaningful, as it can clearly take a lot of damage. I also love how the reward system from Resident Evil 3 Remake returned. I mean, if nothing else, even people who hate this game have admitted that this was one of the few good systems within it. I would be lying if I said that this didn't make me feel compelled to play the game a couple more times and complete some of the challenges to get a couple of the infinite ammo weapons. Oh, and we actually get mercenaries this time. I mean, we've only been asking for the return of mercenaries since Resident Evil 7, but like, cool, whatever. We finally got it now. Let's just be happy about it. The boss fights against Mother Miranda and Lady Dimitrescu were pretty damn fun. Also, near the end of the game, there's these optional puzzle areas you can find in the village before going to fight the final lord, and I really like that. I would like to see future games do more stuff like this, optional side puzzles that reward you with more stuff. And that's the thing, Resident Evil 8 is truly a well-made game with no intention other than to be a fun experience, and I can recognize that, and in that, be happy that mostly everyone seems to be enjoying the hell out of this game. Either that be fans who found Resident Evil 7 too scary, or newcomers to the series, or even just longtime fans who aren't as picky as I am. Even though I might be disappointed with it, it's definitely not the worst direction for the series to take. I'm excited to see what they do next, and what discussions come from this game, because I do think Resident Evil 8 can serve as a great central point for discussion on what does and doesn't work in a Resident Evil game. I mean, if nothing else, this has been the first horror game since Resident Evil 4 that one of my best friends has gotten into. I mean, for reference, my friend has a very low tolerance to horror, so for them to go out of their way to play any horror game, especially without me bugging and prodding them to do so, is amazing. It's been an absolute treat to watch them both be horrified, but also giddy at all the returning aspects from Resident Evil 4, which is one of his favorite video games of all time. And for that reason alone, I couldn't be happier that Resident Evil 8 exists. And I mean, it's not like this series has been known for its consistency anyways. I think that's what kind of makes the series exciting. You never know what you're going to get with the next game or how much you're going to like it. One game you may absolutely love, the next game you may not like all that much or even completely hate. It definitely keeps the series from getting stale, that's for sure. This isn't for me, and it doesn't have to be. It was designed with the goal of being more accessible to a wider audience, and though it may leave more hardcore fans like me a bit let down, it's perfect for what it is. If you've gotten to this point in the video, then I want to thank you for taking the time to actually listen to me. I'm interested in hearing about what you thought of this video or Resident Evil 8, so tell me what you thought in the comment section below. Did you enjoy Resident Evil 8? Did it let you down? Did you hate it? If you like this video, make sure to subscribe, and if you want to see more of me, I stream on Twitch every Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. I hope you all have a great day. I'm Digital Shinigami, signing out. Taking the first-person perspective from 7 and adding in more action elephants? The fuck?